Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Xu. I'm an associate professor from LSU Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Gregory Grandi from CPRA, Coastal Protection Restoration Authority. So Greg received a BS degree of landscape architecture from LSU in 1989, MS degree of environmental management in 1996. After graduation, Greg has worked in multiple institutions or units, including Louisiana Public Broadcasting, EBR Recreation and Park Commission, Louisiana Department of Natural Resources, Coastal Engineering Consultant, as well as CPRA. Mr. Grandi currently holds the position of a deputy executive director with CPRA. His responsibility include leadership of a state agency responsible for the development, implementation, monitoring, operations, and adaptive management of effective, efficient coastal restoration protections project in coastal Louisiana. Now I will open the floor to Greg, and you can start to share your screen.
All right. So first off, I'd like to thank everybody for the opportunity to present to my alma mater. I'm not sure if she's watching, but I'd like to say a special thank you to Margaret Reams, who was my major professor, and all of the faculty and staff that were part of the Department of Environmental Sciences back then, which is now part of the College of the Coast and Environment. Kind of just to give you an idea, I don't have an outline slide, but the outline for today's presentation is in 3 parts. I'll give a brief introduction, then I'm going to do a deep dive into one of our restoration techniques that really talks about harnessing natural processes to restore the ecosystem. And lastly, I'll sort of do a lightning round where I take a look at some other case studies and other briefs just to look at other project techniques that CPRA in the state of Louisiana has used over the years that really speak to this effort of projects that have been built to harness the natural processes. Before I get into that, I just want to kind of frame the introduction that the agency that I work with, CPRA, was formed sort of out of the after the disaster of Hurricane Katrina. And at the time of Hurricane Katrina, there were multiple state entities that were responsible for coastal protection and coastal restoration. And after that disaster, our governor at the time, Governor Kathleen Blanco, made a decision, and the legislature supported her. And the rationale behind her decision was that what happened during Hurricane Katrina, we can't allow to happen again. The failures at the federal, the state, and the local levels were laid bare for everyone to see. And it was extraordinary to see a politician who stepped up and had the courage to admit that, and also have the wisdom and the courage to make the recommendation to create a single state entity that would have the authority to articulate a clear statement of priorities to achieve comprehensive coastal protection and restoration for Louisiana. So the 2 things that she did, she not only created us, but she gave us a mandate to develop, implement, and enforce a comprehensive master plan for coastal Louisiana. Now, the decisions that are included in that master plan, she also charged us that as those decisions were made, they would be built on the best available science that would be the underpinning of that master plan. And that master plan would be the North Star, the vision, not only for the state, but also for our collaborators at the federal government and at the local government to implement projects that eventually those investments will pay off not just for us, but for our children. There was also a challenge that we needed to be transparent in our program to earn back that trust that was lost when Hurricane Katrina impacted our coast. So those are sort of the guiding principles that move forward. And our first master plan came out in 2007. You can see the covers of the three master plans, the second one in 2012, and the most recent one in 2017. All of the master plans that have come out have included objectives. And we've got the 4 objectives that are in the master plan, 5 objectives that are in the current master plan. The working coast is an objective that was added to the 2017 plan. But the 4 objectives from left to right, the flood protection, natural processes, coastal habitat, and cultural heritage, those have been all in all of the plans going back to 2007. And I'm confident that if you went back prior to that to the 2050 plan or previous plans, you would probably find objectives that are similar to these. So these objectives reflect the key issues that affect people in and around Louisiana's coast, seeking to improve flood protection for our communities, to recreate the natural processes that built Louisiana's delta, to sustain our unique cultural heritage, and to ensure that our coast continues to be both a sportsman's paradise and a hub for commerce and industry. So the objective that I really want to kind of dive into today is the natural processes objective. And the definition under that objective is to promote a sustainable coastal ecosystem by harnessing the natural processes of the system. So about a year ago, when COVID happened and many of us were the way we worked was disrupted a little bit, I spent a little time diving into the Coastal Master Plan, and I challenged some of the staff that work here and some other colleagues to help me try to answer this question and provide me some tangible examples of how we have accomplished this objective over the years. Many of you know we have a pretty robust monitoring program for many of our coastal restoration projects. So the question to them was, can you give me some tangible examples, show me projects that have been built over time that exemplify how we have done this? So before I jump into those examples, I just want to kind of go back to this concept of natural processes. And one of the documents when I was studying at LSU for my undergraduate degree in landscape architecture, one of the key documents that we read back then as a young student was published in the spring of 1969. During the environmental awakening, and to give you a frame of reference for maybe some of the younger students on the line, this was published around the same time as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. So Ian McHarg was a landscape architect and geography from Scotland. And this book that he put together was the first work of its kind to present a methodology or design process in which one becomes familiar with the soil and the climate and the hydrology or the processes, and that you would prescribe compatible solutions or alternatives and review those during the design process. And lest you think this is a book by a landscape architect that solely focuses about gardens and designing communities, the sketch at the bottom of the screen is a sketch from chapter 2 of that book, and that chapter 2 is Sea and Survival. And you can see the quotes from the book, from that same chapter, and it talks about natural processes and how can you design solutions to problems that take advantage of those natural processes. And the sketch in the bottom is from the coast in the Netherlands. And I don't know if you can see the drawings or the words on it, but basically he's describing the aeolian, the wind-driven process that deposits sand and starts to create that dune on the backside. And he discusses various ways that the Dutch at that time were trying to use this technique, this natural process, to help benefit the environment. So if you move from designing with nature to about 10 years ago, the Corps started an initiative that they call engineering with nature. And the definition behind this philosophy is the intentional alignment of natural and engineering processes to efficiently and sustainably deliver benefits through collaboration. Those benefits can be environmental, they can be economic, they can be social. And some of the key elements behind how the Corps delivers this, you can see off to the left, is that they produce operational efficiencies through science and engineering. They engage those natural processes to maximum benefit that broaden and extend the benefit of projects, and then a large collaborative process that is part of that. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see some of the folks, the bottom and the right side of the screen, that they've engaged as part of this engineering with nature. Now, one of the great products, deliverables that they created with this engineering with nature was an atlas that came out, I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago, that really highlighted a number of projects that were built across the country that use these principles, or that this principles were used as part of the project. And there were several projects in Louisiana that were highlighted, one of which we'll talk about a little bit later. So in addition to the Corps of Engineers, the folks in the European Union, and particularly led by the Dutch, have a similar philosophy called building with nature. So that building with nature, again, it's a design philosophy that the natural processes deliver a number of benefits, such as protection, and that there's opportunities through creative engineering design, through understanding those natural processes to help deliver benefits to the public. So you've got designing, engineering, building, and harnessing nature. So how does that objective or principle get translated into a tangible project? So what I'm going to do is take a deep dive into some of the small crevasse projects, particularly the MR09, or the Delta-wide crevasse project that the state has been working on for a number of years. So just to give you, I'm probably preaching to the choir, and a lot of folks on this call understand geologic principles a whole lot better than I do, but I'll go ahead and walk you through my presentation, is that one of the natural processes that has been harnessed as a component of coastal restoration technique is crevasse projects. So when we're talking about crevasses, we're talking about a break in the natural or artificial levee, and crevasse splays are the deposits of sediment that form as a result of a crevasse. So crevasses form crevasse splays. So we're taking a look at an example of a natural crevasse that many of you may be familiar with. In 1978, this crevasse was formed, and this is the Brants Pass crevasse. So if you take a look at the aerial photo on the left side of the screen, in 1978, a small opening formed in the natural levee along Brants Pass, allowing water to start to flow into this open water area. If you look at the aerial photo in the middle, by 1991, that crevasse splay had formed with sediment beginning to flow into the crevasse, and colonization of vegetation really beginning to take a firm hold. And then in the far right, 30 years later, by 2008, you've got a sizable crevasse splay that had matured with additional sediment that flowed into the basin and significant vegetation that spread. This is all the result of a natural crevasse that formed in the area. So the question is, how do we recreate that process? How do you design, engineer, build a project to harness that natural process to build land and create habitat? So this is a schematic over an aerial photograph that gives you an example of that. This is an artificial or constructed crevasse. So the same natural processes are at work as in a natural crevasse. The only difference is, instead of waiting for the river to break through its bank, or having it break through its bank in a location that might not efficiently or effectively build land and sustain habitat, we've engineered the system, located the crevasse, and engineered that, and then dug the crevasse so that natural process will begin to build land. Water and sediment flow from that parent channel through the artificial crevasse into the receiving basin. Once the water sediment flow into the basin, the flow spreads out, the velocity slows down, the sediment falls out, and the crevasse splay begins to form in the receiving basin. So again, to take a look at those engineering with nature principles, So as a reminder, that's the core definition at the top. So the intentional alignment of engineering to take advantage of the natural processes to efficiently and sustainably deliver, in this case, environmental benefits through collaboration. And we'll talk about the collaboration a little bit later. So how we do that with crevasses? We reconnected the river to its delta using the engineering and design principles. The river's doing the work, and the engineering principles are used to increase the efficiency. This isn't just about building land, it's about creating habitat and sustaining it in an efficient, effective manner. So to look back, the idea of crevasses had been around for a long time. The Department of Wildlife and Fisheries were constructing these back in the 1980s. It's one that's a technique that's been really cost effective, and we've been able to monitor these for quite a while and evaluate those. So the project that we'll look at in a little bit more detail that I'm going to highlight is the MR09 Delta-Wide Crevasse project. The CPRA and our predecessor, LDNR, were the state partner on this. This was a CRCPA project. Our federal partner on this project was the National Marine Fisheries Service, and it was funded through the CRCPA program. We've completed 3 phases of crevasse construction that includes 9 new crevasses and 19 existing crevasses. We're getting ready a little bit later this year to move out with the 9th phase that will continue construction. If you look at the map on the right side of the screen, this is from the 3rd phase of construction. It's probably a little hard to read, but the orange circles are existing, are maintained crevasses. The orange triangles are newly dredged crevasses, and the green circles are existing crevasses. So as with all of our CRCPA projects, we've done monitoring on these projects to evaluate their effectiveness in meeting the project goals. There were 3 different elements that were monitored during the project. That included elevation surveys, land water analysis, and vegetative monitoring. I'm going to talk about 2 of those just for the sake of time, the elevation and the land water analysis. So this first slide, if you take a look at the green bars, these represent elevation change at a particular crevasse. And I'll note, you'll see an asterisk on the 3 bars. Each of these bars indicates a particular crevasse that was monitored. The 3 bars to the left, we had to stop monitoring those in 2012 because the Corps of Engineers constructed a beneficial use project within the crevasse receiving basin. So our monitoring data for those 3 stations, three crevasses, 6, 7, 8, they don't continue to 2017. But if you take a look at the other crevasses, 9 through 38, from that period of time from 2000 to 2017, we saw a mean elevation change of 1.4 feet in each of those. And this is based on survey transects that were taken, an average of the survey transects that were taken in each of the crevasse receiving basins. There was also one other unique element to this project. I know a number of you are familiar with our Coastwide Reference Monitoring System, or our CREMS program. It's an extraordinary program with about 400 CREMS stations across the state that we monitor a variety of habitats. So it's unique that we happen to have one of these CREMS stations within the receiving basin of one of our crevasse projects. You can make out the boardwalk for that CREMS station in the photo. So for this particular CREMS station, it was installed in 2010. So we have a little over a decade of data. And one of the variables that you all are probably familiar with that we collect at the CREMS station is elevation. These are measured twice a year typically, and the dots on the graph are those elevation surveys, elevation measurements that are taken at the CREMS station. If you fit all the elevations to a trend line at this particular CREMS station, the elevation trend line is about 6.24 centimeters per year. But for those of us who like to talk in inches, this is about 2.5 inches. Over the 10-year period, that would result in about 2 feet of elevation gain at this particular CREM station. So to put that in perspective, there are about 400 CREM stations across the coast. And these are in all kinds of habitat, from salt marsh to swamp, the western side of the state to the eastern side of the state. The average at all the CREM sites is about 0.6 centimeters per year. And if you just look at the CREM sites in the Mississippi River Delta area, the average is about 2.39. So this CREM site is over 6.2 years, and it really illustrates the power of using the river for restoration. So out of all of the 400 CREM sites we have, this particular CREM site has the highest elevation change rate. So I'll go ahead and move on now to a few aerial photos, and we can take a look at some of the land change in this particular area. So for this particular crevasse, number 31, I'll take you through a series of aerial photographs for this crevasse. So this is about a year before this particular crevasse was built, and this was actually a maintenance event for a crevasse that had been built 10 years earlier under a different program. So by this time, we did the maintenance dredging. You can see a splay beginning to form in this area in 1998. So you can see 10 years later, the splay had expanded significantly. There's a lot more vegetation in these areas, and you can see there's a lot of subaqueous sediment, a lot of mud flats out on the margin of the splay that have yet to be vegetated. By 2016, the last aerial photo in this particular series, the splay has expanded even more, and a lot of vegetation is beginning to expand. I'm not sure if you can make out, but some of the shadows in these particular areas, you're starting to see some willow that's starting to form. So the elevation is now starting to support woody vegetation in addition to the marsh grass at the lower elevation. So your statistics from 2001 to 2016, 164 acres were created in this area, which is about 10.9 acres per year. So this was the top performing crevasse during that time period from 2001 to 2016. I'll move on to, this is another crevasse that we'll take a look at. And this will be the last one that we take a look at the aerial photos. This one was constructed in 2004. And you can see to the left, some of the vegetation this is under construction. So this is the location where the crevasse is going to be. The vegetation was starting to be cleared in this area. You can see out to the east, there's actually a pretty good amount of vegetation and a nice receiving basin that will hopefully allow that crevasse, once constructed, to begin to form rapidly. So in 2008, you can see the crevasse is now constructed right here. And you can see sediment starting to form, some mud flats starting to form in these areas. But in this particular area, and I'll go back to the previous slide, in this particular area, there's a lot of land that's lost. So in between these two aerial photographs, you had Hurricane Katrina that really impacted this area significantly. And the vegetation was wiped out. And so that's kind of what's happening in this area during these snapshot in times. Not only was the crevasse constructed, but the vegetation was significantly impacted. If you fast forward to 2012, the splay continues to expand, and you can see vegetation starting to form in some of these areas, and you can begin to see this area that was vegetated previously starting to build back. And then by 2016, we move forward 4 years, the vegetation really takes off. At the top middle of the photo, this area was bare in the last photo, and now there's a significant amount of vegetation. Again, you start to see some shadowing with some of the willow trees along this coast. This is a good example of rapidly developing splay building land. And the statistics, if you take a look at them, it's about +3 acres, or 0.2 if you go from 2002 to 2016. But you have to realize that that time period includes the post-Katrina impact. If you look forward to 2007 to 2016, you do see a land area change of 62 acres, or a change rate of almost 7 acres per year. So if you take a look at this graph, you're looking at the cumulative land gain at all the receiving basins combined. And during the period, the 15-year period from 2001 to 2016, a little over 730 acres of land that was built as part of the Delta Y Crevasse project. So the statistics is the average change area across the crevasses is 31 acres of land, or about 2.1 acres per year during this particular time period. So to wrap up, phases 1 through 9, we constructed 9 new crevasses, maintained 19 existing crevasses. We had an average of 1.4 feet of average elevation gain in the receiving basins, and I think it's significant that this area of the coast that has such a high subsidence rate, you're still seeing a pretty high elevation gain. It's not only it's able to overcome that subsidence rate and still create a significant elevation gain. One of the best things about this technique is the cost. So 739 acres were created. When you do the math, it comes out to a little over $4,700 per acre, which when you compare that to other restoration types, it's probably one of the most cost-effective restoration techniques that we happen to have in our toolbox. So I'll move forward sort of to the lightning round. I'm not going to dive into as much detail on these projects, but I'm just going to give you sort of a snapshot of a couple of other techniques that we believe have had significant impact in helping us harness the natural processes. The first one I'll take a look at is terraces and vegetative plantings. The second one is crevasses and terraces together. The third one is an uncontrolled diversion plus shreds. And then the fourth one is barrier islands and headlands, along with sand fencing and vegetative plantings. So let me move something on the screen here. So another very cost-effective restoration technique that we use in coastal Louisiana is the construction of vegetative terraces. And on the right side of your screen, you'll see a terrace field. This was a project. This was probably built around the same time as some of those earlier projects. I believe this is in the Sabine Refuge. It's a shallow bay bottom where terraces were constructed. And you not only get the benefit of the habitat of the terraces, you get a lot of beneficial edge effect, but you also begin to reduce the fetch and the shoreline erosion on the ponding areas, and keep some of these smaller ponds by breaking through into larger ponds. And those are a pretty cost-effective technique. You see it particularly in Southwest Louisiana, where you have good mineral soils and a lot of shallow bay bottoms over on the west side of the state. But there's another type of terrace project that I want to talk about relative to this harnessing the natural process, and that's the photograph on the left side of the screen. This is the Little Vermilion project in Vermilion Parish. And you can see the terraces that were constructed. This is an area where there's a significant amount of sediment that comes to the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. It comes in these areas, and the positioning of these terraces allows for the sediment to be trapped, and almost the reverse, where a splay begins to form on the front side of these terraces, begins to shallow up. And I'll take a little bit closer look at some of these. So this is the combination of terraces and sediment, the synergy of those to promote natural land formation in areas of sediment availability. So those who aren't familiar with the construction technique for terraces, this is a schematic, and in the photo on the left side, you can see a piece of equipment. It's typically we use either a marsh buggy backhoe or a crane with a bucket mounted on a barge. They dig up area from adjacent to the terrace, and they pile up the material and create either you might call it a small levee or a potato ridge. It's almost sort of an agricultural technique that you see in these areas. And these typically are longer linear features, although sometimes you see sort of curvilinear features as well. So as we take a look at the Vermilion Bay area, I'm going to highlight 3 projects that were built in this area. I'll note the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, if you can follow my cursor, kind of moves from east to west. The GIW heads over into Freshwater Bay. So the first project we'll look at real quick is called the JAWS, TB15. The second one is 4 Mile Canal Terraces, and the third one will be the TB12, the Little Vermilion Terraces. So you can see the Gulf, this is the JAWS that was on the far east. This is the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway in the background. This is where the JAWS flows out into Little Vermilion Bay. You can see the terraces. This is sort of a herringbone or a fishbone pattern. And as the sediment comes down the JAWS towards Vermilion Bay, it settles out, and what we tend to see is mud flats or almost a reverse splay start to form in behind these areas. This is a photograph of one of these splays. Unfortunately, I don't have the time series on the two photos that you're looking at. This is the 4 Mile Canal splays that were a little bit further to the west. In this location, the intercoastal is moving sort of right to left on your screen. Water flows through the 4 Mile Canal out towards Vermilion Bay. And these green areas are where the vegetated terraces were constructed. And the water slowly moves through these channels, and you can see the brown areas were mud flats that over a period of years began to develop as the sediment fell out into these areas. So again, we call this sort of a tire track or a fishnet stocking pattern that was used at the 4 Mile Canal Terrace. It's a little bit different than the herringbone pattern. And lastly, this is the Little Vermilion. So this is one of the mud flats that formed behind one of the terraces. So the terrace allows the sediment to fall out, and the mud flats begin to form in these areas. The next stage that we use, in this case, we planted some California bulrush, a couple of rows. You can see 2 years later, the bulrush has begun to vegetate up nicely. And 4 years later, the bulrush has begun to expand from the area, and other species started to move in. So the initial terraces were used to help the sediment fall out to create the mud flat. Then the vegetation was used. So we accelerated the collination of vegetation in those mud flat areas. And then as the vegetation expands, the vegetation itself begins to start to trap more sediment in those areas, and the processes begin to accelerate on top of themselves. So I'll move to my next, the next case study that I'll look at is the Delta Management at Fort St. Philip. So this is a project on the left side of the screen, this particular area where terraces were constructed and crevasses were constructed at the same time. So we purposefully designed the crevasses to fill in this receiving basin, but terraces were also constructed concurrently at the same time. So again, we talked about the trapping benefit with terraces where there was sediment availability. In this particular basin, we constructed these terraces, and one of the great things you can see from this aerial photograph in 2006, you look at the terraces, they're unvegetated in this photograph. You can see the borrow area where during construction this sediment was borrowed and it was placed to create these linear landforms. So in 2006, you can look at the aerial. 2014, you can really see where the crevasse, there had been some high water years during this point in time. A lot of sediment began to fall out, a lot of trapping behind this terracing, great almost lattice network. You can see some channels beginning to form and sediment beginning to create in these areas. Compared to the previous photograph from 2006, you can really see the vegetation on these terraces, and it just really pops to the eye. When you move forward to 13 years later, 2019, the vegetation is expanded out into those mud flats. And I'll note 2019 was the year that we had the significant flooding on the Mississippi River. And I was fortunate to fly over these terraces in the spring of that year, and this area looked like just chocolate milk in the March-April time period. I'm not sure what month this photo was taken of, but you can see significant vegetation, while at the same time the channels are still open and flowing, and you're continuing to get sustaining flow of water and nutrients and sediment into these areas, and continued land building as well. So I'll move on to the next project that I'll kind of take a snapshot look at. Oops, one too far. So this is the West Bay Sediment Diversion Project. You can see the Mississippi River. We're looking from east to west. West Bay is in the backside. This is the receiving basin. This project was constructed in 2003. This is a CWIPR project that the state of Louisiana and the Corps of Engineers partnered on. The objective of this was to restore marsh in the shallow open water by diverting Mississippi River water. I'll note that the initial target for construction on this was a flow of 20,000, with the estimation that this uncontrolled diversion would grow to about 50,000 over time, and that 50,000 was at about a 50% river capacity. So that 50,000 wasn't at high river or low river, but at approximately at 50%. So if we take just a quick look, the project was constructed in 2003. So the 1998 on the left side was pre-construction. So you can take a look at the basin in this area. And then in the 2008 photo, you can see where the channel was dredged in this location. And you can see early on, there was not a significant amount of land building. There was a lot of sediment that was beginning to flow into the area, but it wasn't yet beginning to pop out and create land. So in 2010 and in 2013, in an effort to accelerate the land building process, the Corps of Engineers constructed these sort of look like terraces, but they call them sediment retention devices, or shreds. So these shreds, the objective of this was to slow down the water in those areas and allow the sediment to fall out. One of the differences between the shreds and the terraces that I showed earlier is the shreds were built when there was maintenance dredging done on the lower Mississippi River. So instead of digging adjacent to the terrace, there was actually dredging, and the sand was placed in these large areas. So those shreds, you can see if you look to the right, the 2020 photo, these shreds have been significantly reshaped by the diversion. The channel is coming down in this area. The channel itself, the morphology is really dynamic. The channel itself is evolved over time, and we do have some great surveys of the channel that shows that morphological evolution. The shreds have been pretty effective at slowing down and increasing the sediment deposition rate. I'll also note that this is 2020, so you did have a few high river years in here, so there was significant sedimentation that was in here. In the 2013, before that time period, you do see some land building in the upper northern part of the receiving basin, but it really explodes on this photograph in 2020. And I'll note, in addition to these two shreds in the upper part, there were some other shreds that were built, and you can see they're vegetated up pretty nicely, and they've been reshaped by the not only the riverine processes, but also the marine processes as well. We take a look at some analysis of elevation data. This is a cut fill analysis both on the left and on the right. This is analysis of elevation survey data between 2011 and 2020. So on the left, you can see where the yellow is where volume was lost. This is typically where channels may be cutting in areas or land may be eroding, and the blue is where the net gain. And I'll note that a lot of blue areas over to the left side of this. Also picked up in this land change is the shreds and in other areas, but we'll go back. So in total, we have a net gain of about 26 million cubic yards within the project area. And to put that into context and in an homage to Lynn Barr, the SDEs, or Superdome equivalent units, would be enough to fill the Superdome about 5.5 times. That's a huge amount of sediment that's been deposited in this area. So that said, I do want to temper our excitement a little bit that some of that sediment that was placed here is sediment that the Corps of Engineers placed as part of not only the shreds, but also part of the beneficial use program. So from 2003 to 2019, the Corps of Engineers, we know that they placed 39 million cubic yards in these areas that are shown in the magenta. Now, the challenging thing is these areas in magenta, we don't have good before and after surveys. So we don't know exactly where the Corps placed material. And I'll also note that some of the areas, particularly along the river, and you can see this kind of freshly placed material that hasn't vegetated up along the river, those areas aren't in our project area. So it's just as it was challenging on the crevasse projects when the Corps placed sediment within our crevasse area, which created fantastic habitat. It's also challenging when they're placing material within our West Bay Diversion Project to factor out what they placed versus what the crevasse delivered to this particular receiving basin. So it's a challenge, but it's a challenge we'll continue to work through. I'll also note that the time period that the Corps placed that material is from 03 to 19, whereas the time period that we used our survey analysis was from 11 to 20. So that said, we're grateful for their partnership. We're grateful that they are beneficially using material, and we encourage that in wherever we can get that. So the last two that I'll take a look at, just to note that we're not completely riverine when we're taking a look at our processes, are a couple of barrier island projects where we use sand fencing during construction to help capture and shape the dune out on the project. So if you can remember back to the sketch that Ian McHarg had in his Design with Nature book back in 1969, as those aeolian processes move sand, particularly freshly placed sand, from dry areas and begin to blow that across the area. One of the lessons we've learned in best management practices is if we place this sand fence, or if you're from up north in Minnesota or Wisconsin, this is snow fence, we place those shore parallel to create a dune of sand that can become one of the project features. And this is a reservoir, so whenever we have a large storm event, that sand is available to help restore the island. In addition, we do vegetative plantings along these dunes, and the vegetation grows over the dunes. And I'll note one of my colleagues, Syed Khalil, has a technical note that he did in conjunction with our partners at the Corps of Engineers that details the use of sand fence and barrier islands and monitors that. So I'll go to the next slide, but I'll say this is the Caminada Headland where this sand was placed. And we've done a number of projects over the years, and I know some of your colleagues or previous colleagues at LSU had done sand fencing projects on Timbaleer Island. And not all the sand fences were built parallel. Some of them were built perpendicular or perpendicular to prevailing winds, or in 45 degrees from the shoreline. What we decided over time is the most effective way to create these dunes was for them to be parallel, because if they were anything but parallel, when a storm came ashore, the wave energy would be focused along those, and you would actually accelerate erosion. So that's why we've moved to more of a parallel dune as opposed to some of the dunes previously. And I'll note this was one of those dunes previously, so this was on the Isle Dernier. This sand was really effective at trapping sediment, at using that natural process to create a feature. Unfortunately, the feature wasn't in the most effective way, so we have changed that. But why I show you this picture is to take a look at the dune vegetation we planted. This is a particular species that loves to grow early colonizing species called bitter panicum. It's a release that the Plant Materials Center has released. This is the Fouchon variety. Loves to grow on blowing sand and grows very quickly and has a high success rate. So when we plant this bitter panicum, on projects, we typically see about a 95% success rate of planting, which is pretty good considering you're planting, putting a plant in the ground, you don't have an irrigation system or fertilizer, and you're basically walking away and letting the natural processes take over. So lastly, I will note, I want to first thank my collaborators on this. And some of the folks who collaborated with this were Mike Miner from the Water Institute, Alex Kolker from LUMCON, and my colleagues at CPRA, Brian Gossman, Theron Hankel, Danielle Ricciardi, Melissa Email, Glenn Curole, Bernard Wood, Kenneth Ballinger, and John Troutman. And I will note one of the outcomes from our collaboration was a series of webinars that CPRA put together, and those webinars are still available today to take a look at. So if you really want to see the experts, the folks who monitor these projects, talk about the data, you can go to this coastal.la.gov/webinar Wednesdays. You can see in the bottom left hand, this was Brian Gossman and Theron Hankel. They went into more detail than I did about the small scale sediment diversions, the crevasses, West Bay. Dr. Mike Miner talked about harnessing natural processes. Alex Kolker spoke about Davis Pond. And then we also talked about hydrologic connectivity. Now, I'll note within our master plan, we also have other project types that we use. There are small-scale hydrologic restoration that I didn't include in my examples today. There's vegetative plantings. There's, of course, the freshwater diversions at Davis Pond and Carnarvon and a number of other projects. But I just wanted to walk you through a little bit of what the staff here at CPRA was able to provide me in response to my question to them. So with that said, I'll be glad to take any questions that you have, and I'm available for as long as you need.
Thank you very much. So anyone who has questions, you can send them directly to me. You can just type your message. Oh, Nancy, do you want to do your question out loud?
Yeah, I'll just ask it. One thing that came through to me from your seminar is that CPRA, CPRA, and U.S. Corps of Engineers often work at cross objectives to get things done. Is there any hope that we can get these three agencies working together?
Yeah, I think we are. We're probably working together better than we have in a long time, and we're collaborating together on a number of things. And I'm hoping we'll have some announcements that'll be coming out next month, Nancy, that will show that collaboration. And I'll make a commitment to you when those announcements. I don't know the announcement will come out next month. It'll be a little bit later. But once that announcement comes out, Nancy, I'm going to shoot you a direct email and remind you of my comment today that hopefully will be fortuitous. And we are collaborating with them on a number of fronts. And I think the partnership's probably as strong as it's ever been. That said, our agency and their agency at sometimes has different missions that they're trying to accomplish, but we are working real hard to collaborate on projects. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
So I've received a comment from Ken, so I'll just read the comment. He said, it's probably important to point out that the terraces Greg focused on are at strategic locations on the GIWW area near the Atchafalaya River. Most terraces are not nearly this effective. Also, it took a long time for the mudflats / accretion to appear even at these locations. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I meant to include that comment, is that the sediment that's coming through the GIW in that location is coming from the Atchafalaya and moving from east to west. So he's absolutely great insight on that, is that in most of the areas where terraces have been constructed, we don't have sediments that is able to, where we're able to harness that natural process. But in these particular locations, we have been able to do that. And I think the combination of the understanding of those terraces and then taking those same lessons and applying them to Fort St. Philip, and then even seeing that lesson in later years applied to the shreds and how those were laid out. As we contemplate future diversions, one of the most important things is how can you efficiently and effectively trap sediment, or what things can you do to more efficiently? So that gets back to this concept of engineering with nature, is understanding that the natural processes, that you've got maybe a riverine process that wants to deposit it, but you might be in a location where you've got a marine process that wants to move it around and resort it, or maybe take it offshore. So while it's beneficial that it gets deposited, if the objective is to create land and create certain habitats, marsh or more upland habitats, being able to trap those efficiently is a challenge to the designers.
I've also received a question from Carol Wilson, and her question is, for the crevasse splays in the MRDF, do you have to maintain the outfall channel after creation? In other words, is there evidence of sediment infilling the channel over time, or is it self-maintained with scour?
Absolutely. Some of part of it depends on the location of the crevasse on the channel. So some crevasses are more efficiently hydrologically, and their receiving basin is larger, so they'll tend to stay open a little bit longer. Some crevasses, if they're further away, and we noted this in our monitoring, is that crevasses that were further away didn't have enough flow to keep them hydrologically open, even though the receiving basin may be able to accept more water. It started to silt itself in because there wasn't enough water to push sediment back into the basin. And I'll note, on all of these projects, we have monitoring reports that are available, and they're available online, typically in a couple of locations. If it's a QIPRA program, if it's a QIPRA project, the lacoast.gov website, you can go into that website and you can search either by basin. I believe you can search by project type, and you can click in there. And if we have a monitoring report, sometimes you might have 3 or 4 monitoring reports. If they are complete on any project that we're working on, not just these projects, but any project across the coast, you can go, that's a QIPRA project, you can go to lacoast.gov. You can also go to the CPRA website and go through the document search or through our SIMS database. You can get there through a variety of means of clicking, but the monitoring report will be there. In addition, all the data will be there, and it'll be, I don't know if it'll be there, but it'll be available through the SIMS, or if you can't find it through the SIMS, you can send us an email at coastal@la.gov, or you can send me an email individually at gregory.grandy@la.gov, and we'll get you connected up with it if you're interested in it.
Ken had a follow-up comment. They said, for some reason, CWPPRA was unwilling to fund additional crevasse splay work in the Delta, and they were curious about that. Do you have any comments about that as well?
But actually, I think we just renewed the MRO9, so the Delta-wide crevasse project that I showed you previously. It was initially authorized in 1999 and went for a 20-year period. So it was from 99 to 2019. And if I'm not mistaken, we're extending that for another 20 years. So this year we're getting ready to construct the phase 4 of the MRO9. I could be wrong on that, but my understanding was that we had reauthorized another 20 years of the work down there. And I'll also note, with the work that's gone on for years and years down at the Delta, you not only see the federal government and the state government building projects, but they've been so effective that businesses that need to do mitigation for work that they do and down in the area, the regulators are comfortable enough with the science that demonstrates the benefit that you've seen a number of private companies that have gone in and constructed mitigation projects by building crevasses. So I think once the folks in the regulatory people tend to be very conservative in what they allow for mitigation and what they don't allow. And once you get to a point where you have enough buy-in from the regulatory community, it's great to see private dollars begin to come in and be used for mitigation in those areas using that same technique as well.
Jen Yao has a question. They said, sorry, it's scroll 1 second. They said, currently, are there any projects monitoring the effectiveness of the beach nourishment at Cameron Parish in Port Fourchon in the aftermath of the 2020 hurricane season?
Okay, so typically the way that we, well, there's kind of two questions in there. One is the shoreline in Cameron Parish. I have to check to see if we have project-specific monitoring. We have another program within CPRA called the BICM program. That's the Barrier Island Comprehensive Monitoring Program. We are anticipating funding will be in place and we'll begin to go out for the third round of statewide BICM surveys on that, maybe a little bit later this year and then in the next 2 following years. So surveys are part of that. We have done some aerial reconnaissance in some areas. I can tell you last hurricane season was probably the most extraordinary hurricane season that I've ever been a part of. Probably some of the biggest impacts that we saw on the shoreline were actually from one of the last storms, Hurricane Zeta, that came in and had a significant impact on some projects that we were constructing in Lafourche Parish and some previous projects in the area. If you followed the news, you may have seen the dune on Grand Isle got significantly impacted. But it wasn't just one storm. You had 4 or 5 storms during the season. So I guess the short answer is we are doing some monitoring. Some of it we've done kind of specific overwashes, but we'll be coming back with BICM monitoring to take a look at some of those areas.
Dr. Eugene Turner has a question about the monitoring for the project site. They'd like to know how the reference sites contextualize the contemporary gains nearby those sites, or if a net gain in the area occurred within a larger area.
Yeah, Gene, I'd have to, and I know you're very familiar with the Crevasse projects down there. I'm going to have one of my folks, probably Mr. Brian Gossman, reach back and answer that question for you. I did not include the reference monitoring stations that were part of that, but I'll have Brian get back in touch with you on the reference monitoring station.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, the next person I can't, oh, I see. So they signed it. So this is from Jun Shu. In each of the previous CPRA coastal restoration plans, a certain number of acreage of new land was proposed to be created, often up to hundreds or thousands of acres of new land. Has the CPRA ever done an assessment on the success rate of the new land creation?
Yes, and we typically do that at the project level. And I'll also note that the USGS also does some analysis on that goes to sort of the basin level reports. But when we get to the project level, we typically do that analysis of land, if it's a land building project, or maybe it's a shoreline protection project where it's the purpose isn't to build land, it's to keep it from eroding behind it. So those are typically done at the project level and now aren't necessarily rolled up to the programmatic level. But those monitoring reports are done at the project level, and those were the ones that I was referencing earlier.
Okay, thank you. If there are any other questions, I think now's the time to send them. I just want to thank you while we have a little break in the questions for the very clear and informative talk.
Absolutely, and while we're waiting for if there are any additional questions that come through the chat, my presentation today was not about. There's a big announcement that was made earlier today. The draft environmental impact statement for the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion was released by the Corps of Engineers today, and I would encourage all of you to take a look at that very carefully. It's the documents, the draft environmental impact statement, and I believe 26 appendices are, as of about 10 o'clock this morning, they were up and available for everyone to take a look at. We encourage productive participation. We want to hear comments from as many different folks as we can hear them from, so that we can respond to those. And if there's ways to make the project better, if there were things we didn't consider, we would love to hear from you. So that comment period officially opened today. It's a 60-day comment period. In addition to the environmental impact statement, there's also a restoration plan that the Louisiana Trustee Implementation Group has released today, and those review processes are in parallel. So you can go to our coastal.la.gov/Mid-Barataria. We have a project-facing website that'll link you to the Corps of Engineers EIS or to the Trustee Implementation Group Restoration Plan. We would encourage everyone here. You guys are some of the brightest minds that understand these processes anywhere. We would encourage you to take a look and make your voices heard. We will be presenting it publicly at our next CPRA board meeting, which will be Wednesday of next week. It's either at 9 or 9:30, but that'll be a public meeting. Given the governor opening up to phase 3, we're going to have that meeting in person at the Capitol, but you can also watch it remotely through the Louisiana Legislature website. So if you don't feel comfortable coming in person, you can listen in. The Corps is going to give a brief presentation on the EIS process, DEIS process. The TIG will give a presentation on the restoration planning process, and then CPRA will give a presentation on the project and some salient information. We understand the DEIS is 1,600 pages, so it is a bit challenging to read through all of it. There is an executive summary that's about 30 or 40 pages, and there's 26 appendices along with it. So we will give a presentation and we'll listen to comments and questions at the board meeting.
Okay, thank you. Ken has another follow-up question. He says, can you say anything about the land building going on at Mardi Gras Pass?
There is, I understand, some land building going on at Mardi Gras Pass. We're not monitoring that because it's not a CPRA project, but I know the folks at the Pontchartrain Conservancy have been monitoring that. And I believe John Lopez, who was formerly there, had released a report and a presentation towards the end of last year that captured the deposition of sediment. They had surveyed it post 2019, so they were able to see that. So there was some significant land building. The Mardi Gras Pass isn't one of our projects, so we are not monitoring that, but we're grateful that our colleagues over at the Pontchartrain Conservancy are.
Okay, I think I have one last question. So this is about the barrier islands. So I've recently seen a figure that ranks barrier island projects as very low in their cost effectiveness for land growth. Is there a metric that's used to evaluate the effectiveness of projects in building resiliency? Because the barrier islands are very good at absorbing the impact of storms, but that doesn't lead to land gain or these usual metrics that people are using.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the barrier islands have a kind of a number of benefits that they have. So it's one of the challenges with barrier islands is they are that first line of defense. So when you compare them to other habitat types or other project restoration types, you can typically see more. A lot of times you can see more change as a result of storms on barrier islands that you won't see in other areas of the coast. And I'll note this last year was particularly evident in some areas where you had rollback. One of the benefits from those barrier islands is the salinity gradient that you see in the basins behind it. If you start to lose some of those landforms, it becomes challenging for opening up that area to the salinity and the estuaries behind it beginning to change more rapidly than they are currently. So there are some storm protection benefits, particularly if you look at the barrier islands in Plaquemine Parish. And I could reference you to some reports that Ty Walmsley and some of his colleagues at the Corps of Engineers did on storm surge that really showed that those barrier islands that were closer to land had a significant benefit, and the ones that they were a more intact shoreline had significant protection benefits from the storm. The challenging things when your barrier islands get a little bit further from the shore, particularly think about the Chandelier Islands, its storm protection capacity is lessened because it's so far away. And I know even if you go back further, List and others had modeled some of that. Shea Penland at UNO had modeled some of that. The further away the island gets, the less benefits you begin to get. I'll also note you've got habitat out there that's extremely imperiled. Wildlife and Fisheries documents it as one of the most imperiled habitat that we've got. So we also know that without the restoration that we have done, particularly on the Isle Derniers, those islands, most likely, if you look at projections that the USGS had back in the 1980s, the majority of those islands would probably be gone, if not for the work that Terrebonne Parish started back in the 1980s, and the EPA and CWIPRA and the state began back in the early 1980s. So barrier islands are a challenging technique to use. I'm having some issue. I think I'm having some battery problems on my computer. The barrier islands are a challenging issue to face. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, okay. If you have any resources that you'd like to share with everyone, you could just respond to my email to you and I could redistribute them. So if you want to, just share anything that's related to the follow-up questions.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I am going to ask one of my colleagues, Brian Goffman, to reach out to Gene Turner separately about his question about the reference areas on the MRO9 project.
Sure, thank you.
Greg,
Okay,
thank you.
we'll wrap it
Thank
up
you
here.
so much, Greg. Let's give Greg a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful talk. We are fortunate to have you to give a wonderful seminar for our college and for LSU. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.